Hello, my name's Ian Hamilton. I'm a researcher and academic at the University of York and also a mental health nurse, but that's in the past, but that certainly informs the work I do now. So I just briefly want to talk about addiction and drug use, and been thinking really lately about what it is we know about drug use generally and those that develop problems, and what we don't know. And this really was triggered by an article I read by Doug Selman, which was written I think about a decade ago, in which he was challenged by students to outline what we knew about drug use and addiction in particular. And that article, I can put the link up, is the 10 things, or the 10 debates about drug use and drug addiction. Anyway, what I'd like to focus on, I think, is just highlighting where we're at in terms of our kind of collective understanding around addiction. So the first thing I'd like to say is we still don't have a universally accepted kind of statement or theory on addiction. So as many of you will be aware, some people really advocate for a disease model of addiction. In other words, this is almost predetermined by genetics and certainly biology. As you go through life, it has a big part to play in the way that you kind of physiologically and psychologically react to drugs, making some people predisposed to developing a psychological or physical dependency. I take us as far as I can, and on what I've read and talked to others about so far, I prefer to see a kind of blend of that and environmental factors, social factors, obviously, what happens in your formative years as you grow up. And because of my experience in drug treatment, meeting many people who faced adversity and somehow survived that, but one of the outcomes was that they developed a problem with drugs. They became dependent. So I see it as a mix, nature and nurture, as it were. But it'd be interesting to hear what your views are. But anyway, moving on and just thinking about, we can't cover it all. The video would be too long, and also I'd run out of things to say. But just to give you an example of a couple of areas that I think are good examples of how little we know about addiction. So despite everything that's been written, and lots has been written about addiction, that shouldn't be taken as a proxy for us actually knowing very much. So I think any question is legitimate, any research looking to improve understanding is completely necessary. So the first thing I want to talk about is something really basic, and that is, what do we know about the difference between women and men when it comes to drug use? And it turns out very little, or rather, we know far more about men than we do women. Now, in 2019, to me that's quite shocking to think that we know so little about women. And there seems to be a number of things that have contributed to this. So first of all, there's kind of a systems problem in which there are clearly more men who are in senior positions, either as researchers, policy makers, or even journal editors, than there are women, and that I think has contributed to either ignoring or not taking full benefit of women in research, women in policy, and female colleagues in academia who clearly are bright, brilliant, and have something to contribute to our understanding around addiction. But it's not just about the systems problem, it's also about, if you like, male researchers looking at male participants. So we know that many studies don't report or don't even investigate a reasonable proportion of men and women when it comes to addiction. What's even worse than that is we know that some studies are collecting that basic demographic information, i.e. what happens to men and women in trials or in observational studies, but then they don't report it. And to me that's criminal, to have that information and not make it available or accessible limits our understanding of men and women when it comes to drug use. So let's hone it down even further. An example would be something that I've looked at, which is Cannabis and Psychosis. That area of research has proved popular, intriguing to many people, and I think that's partly because cannabis is so widely used. But we still haven't got to the point of being able to make a causal link between cannabis and psychosis. So again, this is where environmental and social factors, I think, are really critical. But to look at gender in relation to that, we know very little about women and cannabis and psychosis. Most of the studies have either exclusively recruited men or haven't included a fair proportion of men and women. So in other words, they've over-recruited men. And this has left to a very poor understanding of what happens to women who use cannabis and what their risk of psychosis is. And to me, that's a real intriguing area, because I think potentially if we understood women's relationship with cannabis, and in particular their risk of developing psychosis or not, that may help us understand more broadly what the relationship is between cannabis and psychosis, and may actually help us prevent young men particularly from being at risk of developing psychosis. So lots to look at. Broadening out even further, when we look at so cannabis and psychosis is pretty rare. Roughly about 1 in 20,000 people will be impacted by cannabis psychosis, but something that's far more common apparently is cannabis dependency, so developing an addiction, if you like, to cannabis. And again, here it turns out historically we've had some problems in the way that's been assessed. So the kind of most popular figure or data that's used to give examples of the likelihood of dependency on cannabis is roughly about 1 in 9, 1 in 10 people who use cannabis regularly. That's not just people who occasionally have a spliff, but people who use cannabis regularly will develop a dependency. It doesn't sound a lot, but when you consider there are millions of people who use cannabis and hundreds of thousands who use, even in the UK, who use it regularly, then that 10% figure you can see can add up to potentially thousands, if not tens of thousands of people. But here again we have a problem with gender, in that most of the research that we have, most of the evidence that we have, has really been biased towards men. So to give you an example, the criteria that's used to define cannabis dependence internationally is something called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and it has various versions. They keep getting updated, but up until the most recent version of DSM that was used, many of the, or I shouldn't say many, sorry, some of the questions that were used in order to assess whether someone was dependent on cannabis really had a gender bias in the way the questions were framed. So for instance, asking someone whether when they were driving a lorry or operating heavy machinery they were ever under the influence of cannabis, we can clearly see is something that is more likely to be answered in the positive by a man than a woman. Even in 2019 there are still more male lorry drivers than there are female lorry drivers. So it might be that we've underestimated the number of people, the number of women particularly, who become dependent on cannabis. We just don't know them. So it's even something as basic as that. You can see the problems we have generally in the field of addiction, and it's a problem in the one sense, but in another way it's an opportunity to try and improve the information we have, and it has a real world application. You know, cannabis use is being opened up across the world as policy changes. So I think it's really important that we get good, credible information about what the risks are. Thanks for listening, and hope you found it useful, and be really interested to hear your thoughts. Thank you. Bye for now.